Good morning and welcome back to our series, Believe in Me, Jesus in the Gospel of John. And today we are in lesson 7. So we're making our way through here, really making progress through our series for Jesus' raising of his friend Lazarus. But before we begin, let's review our lesson from last week. So last week we were in John 9 and 10 about Jesus healing of the man born blind. So we had, had a really good discussion, a lot in that. What has stuck with you, or have you been thinking about this week, or what do you remember that we learned in that lesson?
I always think it's funny that, funny is not the correct word, but everybody assumed that someone had sinned, either he had sinned or his parents had sinned, and we hear somebody, oh, you've got cancer. First thing we don't say is, oh, you must have sinned, you got cancer.
Thank goodness, I'm so glad.
It's so different in our world of how we see things like that.
Yeah, just the prevalence of that idea of someone sinned, it led to this disability, the trouble, the suffering that he was undergoing. And I think, it didn't occur to me until I was well into today's lesson that this theme is running through all these healings. We have not let up on this theme from the man who was healed from the pool of Bethesda, who stopped sinning, or something worse, to the man who's born blind. Neither him nor his parents sinned, but that the work of God might be accomplished, to Lazarus. And we will see how this theme continues. It's quite subtle in today's passage, but it is still there. We're still following this all the way through. And it ties into a major question that people often have about Christianity. Well, but why is there suffering? Why do these things happen? Why does God allow that? What is God going to do about that? And so we will keep that question in mind as we go through today's lesson. Yeah, great point. What else?
We must work the works of him who sent me, as long as they're not as him, or no one.
Shirley, your signal is breaking up. It may be my connection and not yours, but try one more time.
We must work of the works of him who sent me.
Yes. So that idea of Jesus working the works of the Father has run through these lessons as well. Jesus said, my Father is always working, and therefore I am working. He continues to say, if you recognize the work of God in me, you'll believe in me. And here he begins to include his disciples. As you emphasized, we must work the works of the Father. And so we saw that inclusion of what it means to be a part of Jesus' ministry is to continue the works of God in the world. Yeah, great point. What else? Chris?
The willful blindness of the Pharisees, I believe.
Yeah.
That was really brought out last week. Are we blind? In their comment.
Yeah, and Jesus called them not seeing that, as you say, willful blindness of the Pharisees is what Chris said, and how strongly that was brought out. And Jesus calls that sin. He said, because of that, your sin remains. And so we really, I think it confronts us quite boldly when, as people who are religious insiders, we could say, what is Jesus doing that we need to see? What is the way in which I need to have my eyes open, and can I let Jesus do that? And that really is a question that we need to take with us. Yeah, great point. What else?
There was a reference to creation with the dust of the earth that he used to heal the blind man. It was creating a new man.
Yeah, so we saw these layers of symbolism and meaning in the way that Jesus healed this man, and it sort of culminated with the idea of out of the dust of the earth, just as God in creation created out of the dust of the earth, Jesus has created new sight. Jesus has brought someone in the darkness into the light by that new creation, and the sense of believing in Jesus as stepping into the light is how we can participate in that. Yeah, great point. And then we also saw, the man, his belief in Jesus grew over time as he repeated his testimony. That changed him. His repeating what God was doing in his life and for him changed his heart. It changed his witness. And so, what is God doing in my life that I can talk about, that I can acknowledge out loud, and how will it change me as well as those who hear it? Yeah, so a lot of really just thoughtful points that have stuck with me this week. Anyone else want to say anything about last week's lesson?
They even asked his, oh, go ahead. They even asked his parents. They said, was this your son? They
Yeah,
said, I know it's my son. But then the parents got afraid.
the parents were afraid. Yeah, and so we saw that, okay, there's a couple of things there. One, there was a tie-in of the man's identity. His identity was under question in the same way that Jesus' identity keeps being under question. And the man's parents testified, yes, he is who he says he is. Meanwhile, the works of the Father have been testifying about Jesus, that Jesus is who he says he is. And so we have that like sort of literary parallel. Yeah, and then Carrie, what were you going to say?
That made me think just now that this notion persists even today. If we don't want to believe something, then it's fake news to us, or we deny the validity of all of that. But I also want to say that this is yet another opportunity that Jesus heals for the purpose of glorifying his Father, not for his own reputation or his own glory, but it's that God may be glorified through him and through these healings.
Yeah, okay, great. So 2 points. One, their belief was their unwillingness to believe the truth was the problem. And so how can we confront ourselves in that way as well? Jesus went into the whole shepherding metaphor out of calling them out as bad shepherds, just like we saw in Ezekiel 44, the bad shepherds of Israel, right? And so, if we are shepherds or sheep or both, that metaphor is fluid, right? We get to be both shepherds and sheep. Then how can we do as God would will us to do in that, to be good shepherds, to be sheep that know the voice of Jesus. And then we saw that idea of the glory of God, and that also will thread through to today's lesson, the glory of God. So let's get into that. Would someone please read John 11, verses 1 through 16?
I'll do it.
Okay.
Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews there tried to stone you, and yet you are going back? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in the daytime will not stumble, for they see by this world's light. It is when a person walks at night that they stumble, for they have no light. After he had said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, also known as Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Good reading. Okay. So John is introducing us, go back to verse 1, to some new characters. And he knows that he hasn't mentioned them in his story yet, but he also seems to think that we know something about who they are. How would we know these people? Okay, the Mary that anointed Jesus, right? So this story was known in the early church, right? It was known to John's readers. How else might we know it?
The same Mary and Martha that quarreled over how they should serve Jesus at the meal.
Right, okay, so Mary and Martha show up in the synoptics. So we meet them, although Lazarus does not, interestingly. Lazarus is only mentioned in John, but Mary certainly is in the synoptics, and there's a story of the anointing of Jesus in every single one of the Gospels. Now, the details vary, and in Luke, they vary so substantially that we sort of wonder if it's even the same story. They're hard to quite, you have to go like, I wonder exactly how this perspective, but in Matthew and in Mark, it is a late stage anointing as it is in John. And so that's probably the same story. It may be that Luke, that is a story that happens very early in the ministry, and maybe, we've said our chronologies don't need to be strict here, especially under an ancient expectations of writing, but it may be that is a different event. And then John also, I think this is worth mentioning, that John has the same expectations as the rest of Scripture, that we will read it back and forth. These are not stories that are meant to be read once straight through and then we're done with them, right? Scripture is meant for meditation, going forward, moving backward, looking both directions, and that's how we really find the rich value in Scripture. It's hard to find without doing that, and so John has that expectation as well. Well, what does John want us to understand about these people, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, in verse 1 and 3 and in 5 as well?
He loved them.
He loved them.
They were close friends.
They're close, they're friends, right? These are people that Jesus cares about and has personal relationships with over time, right? What do you think the sisters are thinking or expecting when they send word to Jesus?
They want Jesus to come and heal their sick brother.
Right.
They know he's done this before.
Okay, Linda says they know Jesus has healed before. They want Jesus to come heal their sick brother. And of course, right? Don't you think that we would expect this? If we knew a healer, we would say, hey, we're your deepest friends, your closest people. Come use that healing on us. They reasonably think so. In verse 4, what does Jesus say, and who is he talking to?
Talking to his disciples.
Is he talking to his disciples? They're there, and Jesus addresses them in verse 7.
But somebody brought the message.
Somebody brought the message from the sisters, from Mary and Martha.
So could it be the person who brought the message or those who are gathered around to hear the message? I'm sure when a messenger comes running into town from far place forth has something to say, it gathers a crowd.
Yeah.
Could it be everyone?
Everyone, maybe. There's definitely a sense of a general pronouncement here, because what does Jesus say? Let's look at this. He says, what's going to happen?
It's for the glory of God.
It's for the glory of God that what?
No death will happen.
Okay. Okay, so I love that, because Linda said no death will happen, but does it say no death will happen?
It will not end with death.
It won't end with death, but it doesn't, and if we were hearing that, we would very naturally say, he won't die, right? This sickness will not end in death. Well, okay, I think that is maybe slightly cryptic phrasing, but we would think like the most plain meaning of that is Lazarus is not going to die. And yet that isn't exactly how Jesus says it. And so this is probably the return message that the messengers will take. These messengers have come into town. They're standing there. They tell Jesus the news. The one you love is sick. Mary and Martha need you. Are you coming? Are you coming? Come on. And all they get is this message to take back. This sickness will not end in death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified by it. And that glorified by it is a key word in John. What does it usually mean when Jesus goes to his glory? What's that? Death, right? We will see it later. We haven't seen it yet. This is our backwards and forwards reading, right? When Jesus says the hour of the Son of Man to be glorified is here, he means it's time for the cross. And so Jesus has this pronouncement, and this is all the messengers have to take back to the sisters. And the reason that I think that this goes to the sisters is because later in verse 40, Jesus will say, didn't I say? And we go like, when did you say? I didn't notice you saying that. And he didn't say it. Either it's not captured, or he's talking about this statement here, and this was probably a statement to go back with the messengers. So I think we can understand this as this is what the messengers have taken back. So when we have that key phrase, the Son of Man to be glorified by it, but we also have the glory of God, which has always meant all the way through Scripture that in some way God's true nature will be revealed. And so that's the setup for this story, right? In the last two healings, we talked about the nature of sin and death in the world and how there's suffering caused by it and what God is doing about it. And so John has set up for us, we're going to continue to talk about how God is glorified in all of this. Other questions or comments on that?
Well, Mary and Martha had said to Jesus, he would not have died if you'd have been here.
Yes, they are going to say that. It's quite a grief-filled statement, isn't it? It's a very emotional statement. Yeah, so hold that thought. Let's look at something curious in verse 6. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister Mary. Therefore, this word so in my translations, I don't know what other translations y'all have. So, yet is not correct. I'm going to have to just say no.
Accordingly.
What's that? Accordingly. This is not, there are kind of generic words, like generic connecting words that can be and, yet, so, but this is not that. This is literally the word for therefore. Yeah. There's a causal relationship here. Jesus loved, so cross it out and put so, therefore. Our translators found that so curious that they had difficulty translating it as therefore. They had a hard time pushing that through to us. We're going to see one more instance of our translators having such a hard time with the literal meaning of a word that they just gave us a different meaning later in our passage. Jesus loved Mary and Martha, yet he stayed where he was, makes sense to us.
Yeah.
Jesus loved Mary and Martha, therefore he stayed where he was, does not. Right? We don't quite understand that. If someone you love is in trouble and you can help by being there, you go, don't you? He didn't go. Not only does Jesus not immediately set out, but it says this delay is out of love. So we have to keep that puzzle in our mind as we do the rest of the passage to understand this passage
He
well.
said he knows the bigger picture.
Okay, he knows the bigger picture. That's exactly where we're going with this
So
bigger
the Son
picture.
of God is going to be glorified, therefore he sat where he was.
Therefore, he sat where he was. Yeah, Lee.
My translation, it actually has the word accordingly as the first word in verse 5. Like it's using, I'm assuming that that's the word that yours is translating therefore, but mine's putting it at the beginning of 5, like it's connecting the glorification to the falling.
I
As
think
opposed
that
to-
word is in 6. I have looked that up, but I haven't looked up. Let me see if I can
The
get.
6 for me just says, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was.
I think, let's check the ordering here. We're not even in the right chapter.
So verse 4 is ending so that God's Son may be glorified
Through it,
accordingly.
period. And then number 5 says, accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus.
It's in verse 6 in the Nestle's Greek. I don't have that. What translation do you
New
have?
Revised Standard Version.
Yeah, so that would come out of Nestle. So yeah, that was just a translator's
they
choice.
just decided to
They
link
just
the
decided.
glorification with so it's almost like a therefore, because it's like between the glorification.
Yeah, or maybe they thought that made more sense of it. It's hard to make sense of that therefore.
Yeah.
And I think the translators are struggling with it, and we need to wrestle with it as well. And so that may be one result of their wrestling with it. Yeah, because it's in verse 6. And it's actually 2 words, and it's like, so as therefore, although the therefore is not, Greek doesn't usually put that word first in a sentence. Anyway, okay. Yes. Let's get rid of that. That's distracting. Okay. So Jesus therefore stays 2 more days. Doesn't make sense to us. We're holding on to that. And let's talk about where Jesus is, like why, and it makes sense to us that he stays where he is, because where is he? Look back at John 10, 40 through 42. And he went away again. Okay, so look, actually, we'll go one more verse back, verse 39. Therefore, they were seeking again to seize him, and he eluded their grasp. So this is one of the many, probably 7, times that they're going to seize or stone Jesus, and he slips away. And the place he goes, he went away again beyond the Jordan to the place where John was first baptizing. Now, this is a place we meet in chapter 1. There is a location in 128 mentioned beyond the Jordan. It's called Bethany beyond the Jordan, a different Bethany from the Bethany he's going to go to, which is maybe why John doesn't mention that it's called Bethany, because he doesn't want to be confusing. But beyond the Jordan to the place where John was first baptizing, and he was staying there. So Jesus has a place to stay in this location, and that shows up in chapter 1 as well, because the disciples say, oh, I'm not on camera, I'm so sorry, I hope that was audible. The disciples say, they ask him, where are you staying? And he says, come and see. And so Jesus must have a place to stay in this location out where John was first baptizing. He goes there. Verse 41, many came to him and were saying, oh, John performed no sign, but everything John said about this man, Jesus, was true. And many believed in him there. So what is the atmosphere for Jesus like where he is?
More hospitable.
More hospitable?
Welcoming.
More welcoming?
Believing him.
They're believing in him, right? It's friendly for once. He's just been attempted to be seized, attempted to be stoned time after time after time. And finally, he is somewhere where no one's trying to seize or stone him. He has a place to stay. People believe in him. And so staying there seems like a really good idea from a standpoint of Jesus' personal safety. And his disciples think so too. What does he say in verse 7 and following, Jesus? What does Jesus say in verse 7 and following?
Let's go back to Judea.
Yeah. How's that go over with the disciples? Let's go back to Judea.
Where they stoned you?
Where they were stoning you?
What?
They're like, we're kind of tired of being seized and stoned all the time. Right? So this is hard. This is very difficult. The siblings live in Bethany, which is just a 2-mile walk from Jerusalem. And so we know that the politics and persons from Jerusalem do overflow from Jerusalem to Bethany. We'll see that literally happening as the story goes on. And so the disciples are like, wait, what? Could we not? And Jesus' disciples try to talk him out of going. And we get quite a parallel to when Jesus' brothers, it's like, and Jesus is out of Judea, and the brothers tell him, and his life is in danger in Judea, so he's out of Judea, and the brothers were like, you should go back to Judea. And they try to convince him, and he will not go. But here, the disciples try to convince him not to go, and yet his decision is it's time to go. Now, verse 9 is the passage I mentioned last week. I said my commentary called a little piece kind of a riddle. Verse 9 is that piece. I don't know, a riddle might be a little overstatement. What might Jesus mean in this verse? Are there not 12 hours in the day? If someone walks in the day, he's not stumbling. What could he mean there?
I think if they're following him, they're walking in the light. If
They're following him, they're walking in the light. Exactly. Jesus is really just saying here, look, you're not in danger yet. This is not, it's still day. Day is a fixed period. That, remember, the day of Jesus' ministry approaching the night of his death on the cross. And so this is another way of Jesus saying, my hour has not yet come, so you don't need to worry quite yet. Mary.
But the 12 hours is a finite time. The time is coming. The night is coming.
The night is coming. Yes, we definitely. I love that you mentioned that. That is some foreshadowing here, isn't it? The 12 hours is a finite time. Yes, you're not in danger quite yet. That doesn't mean we're never in danger. The time is coming. Absolutely. It's closer now than it has been. Okay, verse 14, Jesus' riddles are leaving the disciples confused, right? So he finally says plainly, Lazarus is dead. What do you think this moment is like for the disciples?
Oh, you're too late.
We're too late. It has to be a devastating moment for them, right? They must have also loved these siblings. They've been following Jesus long enough to develop the relationships with the people that Jesus developed relationships with. This has to be a point of great grief and sorrow for them, and also confusing. What's confusing about this?
He says he's glad about it.
He's glad about it. Weird thing to say, right?
Sounds insensitive.
It does sound a little insensitive, right? Although I think that it was probably said in a tone of grief as well. But yeah. And it's confusing. Why else is it confusing?
I thought Jesus could do anything, and he let this happen. He didn't know it.
Right. This sickness will not end in death. Lazarus is dead. What is going on? Right? He said it wouldn't end in death. That's why you said if he's asleep, that'll be good. Like, why wouldn't we think you meant natural sleep? Because you said this sickness would not end in death, and it all seems very contradictory and confusing. Right?
And they waited 2 more days.
Okay. Right. Okay. Mary says, and he said, for your sake, I was glad. And they're like, don't do it for my sake. I'd rather Lazarus live. What do I have to do? I don't want a part of that. And then what did you say, Sandy?
Oh, and he waited 2 more days before they went.
Yeah, those 2 days have to be just like haunting them now. And plus they have the journey time to get back. So, there's going to be at least 4 days between whenever Lazarus is dead and when they get there, So these days, wow, this has to be a rough moment for them. And yet what is Thomas's reaction and what do you think of it?
Let us go and die with him.
Let's go and die with him. What do y'all think of that?
That's the riddle.
How is that a riddle? What say more about that?
Why is he saying we'll die with him? Why are they
Okay.
going to die with Lazarus? What's the connection?
Okay, so I think the hymn here, so this is, we have talked about how ancient writing is not as strict about pronoun reference as we would like sometimes. I think the hymn is Jesus. Okay, why do they not want to go back to Judea? Because in Judea, they're stoning Jesus.
Oh.
And if they're stoning Jesus and Jesus' life in danger, probably Jesus' direct disciples' lives are in danger as well. And so when Thomas says, let us go and die with him, die with Jesus. And this is it's a good question. Like the commentaries even address, is this talking about dying with Lazarus, who's just said to be dead, or dying with Jesus, whose life is in danger for stoning? But the way the context reads, the consensus seems to be Jesus. So
It makes more sense.
well, it makes more sense of Thomas's statement. Yes, yeah, good point. So Thomas is willing, right? So it's dramatic. That this line has always struck me as like a bit of melodrama, and yeah, it's accurate because Jesus will indeed die, and many of his disciples will as well. And so, is this doubting Thomas? Yes, it is. Well, I think the moniker doubting Thomas is really pretty unfair. So we will get there later in the study. Actually, I don't know. That may be a passage that we're not scheduled to cover directly. But let's just take it for right now. Thomas doesn't want to believe without seeing what the other disciples saw, but they saw it. So that comparison's a little unfair. And then as soon as Thomas does see it, it's my Lord and my God. And so his conviction, once convinced, he's there. He's all in for Jesus. And we see it right here. So I think that's a great point to connect, that we see that behavior in both of these scenes with Thomas. Yeah. Chris?
It might also be, let us go and die with them, because Lazarus and Jesus.
Well, it's singular. The
Lazarus
pronoun is singular,
Yeah.
but you could sort of extrapolate. Yeah.
There's also a hint here with Thomas's statement. Jesus has been talking to them a bit about dying in his dying. And this may be a conversation they've had quite a bit. And how far are we willing to go? Are we willing to die?
Yeah.
If he's accosted?
Yeah.
Because he's been stoned, people are after him, they're aware of
Right?
it.
How could they not have talked about it?
Right.
It's a great point. Jesus' life has been in danger over and over, and there was no change in the situation. Jesus just keeps slipping away because his hour is not yet come. And so, yes, this has to be on their minds. I think that's a great point.
So this could also be a revelation of how committed the disciples are to Jesus at this point.
And some foreshadowing, because maybe they aren't committed in the way that we might expect in the scene of the cross, but they are committed long term. Yeah.
And keep following.
Yeah.
Stay with him.
Well, someone read 17 through 35 for us. Let's do that next.
On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in a tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at the home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she said to him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world. And after she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and is asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was moved deeply in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. How far?
37.
Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he have opened the eyes of the blind man? Have kept this, he who had opened the eyes of the blind man, have kept this man from dying?
Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah. So let's move back to verse 18. It says, a large crowd of the Jews were with Martha and Mary. So who are these people? Like, everyone's Jewish in the story. So who are these people?
Did they observe Shiva at this time?
I don't know that. Yeah, I mean, there was a definite, like, a procedure of mourning, and that's what you're asking. I don't know how that's developed over the years and what it would be different
I
here.
would just assume that they had gathered and they'd been there for several days.
Okay, people that have come to mourn with them, where are these people from?
Jerusalem.
Yeah. You know, if it's of the, we're talking about like how the Jerusalem's only a 2-mile walk away, right? Which people walked a long way in these this period, right? Because what other choices are there? Bethany was near Jerusalem and many of the Jews, right? It's connected the way that it's written. So this is probably the same of the Jews. Remember how the groups of the Jews who were against Jesus were the Jews in authority? Like it was specifically talking about the Jews who had authority and were against Jesus. And it's using the same language here in connection with Jerusalem. So at least some of the religious leaders have come, and at least some of those religious leaders are opposed to Jesus. And so it's quite a mixed bag, these people who have come to mourn with Mary.
And Lazarus was probably pretty well known. Can we assume that?
Can we? I don't know.
If he were.
He will get well known, certainly.
If he were well known, this would be some of the leaders who would be coming to minister to the family and perhaps minister in his death, whatever their official capacity might be there.
Yeah. So some of the leaders might be there to minister. I mean, which is what coming to grieve with them is. It is a ministry, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. Someone already mentioned what Martha says to Jesus. What do you think? That if you had been here, my brother would not have died. What do you think of her statement and their conversation? What do you notice?
It's a heartbreaking statement.
It's heartbreaking. It really is. Yeah. What
He
else?
blames him for his death.
There's a sense, Pam said it sort of blames Jesus for his death, and there is a sense of reproach there,
But she also
especially as Mary repeats it. Yeah. What else?
she also has great faith that he could have, he wouldn't have been sick or wouldn't have died. So she believes.
Okay, so two ways that she believes. One is that she believes that Jesus's healing authority would absolutely have been sufficient to the situation, right? And then also, what else does she believe?
That Jesus still has the power.
Resurrection.
Even now, we have to wonder, is she expecting a raising here? It's an open question that I don't think we can tell from the text, right? It's like she seems to imply that Jesus could still fix it, and yet does she completely dare to believe that that's a real possibility? She says, even now I know the Lord will give you what you ask, because Jesus says, your brother will rise again, and she kind of qualifies it, doesn't she? Right? She says, well, I know he'll rise in the last day. And Jesus makes the fifth of his 7 I am metaphor statements. I am the resurrection and the life. And this one is even more abstract than some of the others. What do you think of this statement? What does this mean? I am the resurrection and the life.
He is the resurrection the Jews have been waiting for.
Okay, he is the resurrection the Jews have been waiting for, but how? Because he's standing there.
That's foretelling.
Some foreshadowing there, some looking forward. What else?
Well, that if they believe in him, they will never die.
Okay, if you believe in me, you will never die. So this is very interesting, right? Because that line seems to interpret, there's a great interpretation principle is to take what's said next and see if it helps us interpret what has been said, right? So I do think that he who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die, right? And so this is an interpretive statement that interprets, I am the resurrection and the life, and we can anticipate this being true of Lazarus. We know the story. But what about everyone else? Lazarus is just one person. Everyone's going to die, including you and me. And so what does this mean? We also, in John, if we get to something and we're like, well, that's puzzling, what does that mean? We check the prologue, see if there's something in the prologue that helps us interpret it. And so in him was life is in the context of creation out of the prologue. Everything was made through Jesus. And so we have a little bit of an anticipation that if everything was made through Jesus and he is the resurrection, to come back to life, that all things will be remade through Jesus. And so he's pointing forward to that. And we get Martha's great confession here, don't we? What have you heard referred to as the great confession? Who says the great confession? Peter. Okay, how come Martha doesn't get the same credit as Peter? I'm putting forth Martha for another sayer of the great confession, right? Because she says, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, he who comes into the world. This is exactly as powerful as Peter's great confession. It is exactly as faithful. It is given in the most grief-filled time that she could have. And here is her great confession. It's so critical. And you notice that when we go to chapter 20 and read John's purpose statement for the book, Martha's confession corresponds to it, right? Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, he who comes into the world. And so John is just like pointing all the lights at this confession. Go ahead, Linda.
I see this as a great transition. Verse 24 is a statement of the old Jew belief. And she believes that one day we will all be resurrected. Then Jesus talks about who he is and what he is there to do. And then she believes in him. She's given up the old belief.
Okay, so
I see that as really a transition between here's where Jews were and here's where you're going now, says Jesus.
Okay.
And then
Which, is it giving up the old belief? Or is it fulfilling the old belief, right? Okay, so Linda says, like in verse 24, the resurrection the last day, this would be a Jewish understanding of resurrection that like the Pharisees held and the Sadducees didn't. Like we've talked about that in the past. That Jesus clearly does hold, right? Jesus is on the side of the resurrection, and yet it's the resurrection that happens through Jesus, right? And so what we're getting, what Jesus is about to do, this conversation tells us, there's a lot of theology in this conversation, right? This is the great moment of grief, and yet they're having this deep conversation. What Jesus is about to do defines what it means for him to be the Christ, the Son of God. This defines what it is he's doing in the world. And so Martha goes away, presumably back to the house. And because of all these visitors around, she I don't know if she whispers or pulls Mary into the next room. Somehow she tells Mary secretly that the teacher is looking for. I think it's noticeable that this is what they call Jesus between each other, the teacher. These are disciples. They are disciples of Jesus. They've proclaimed the truth about Jesus, their faith in him. And so Mary comes and echoes Martha's grief-filled statement. Exactly. And I feel like that tells us that that's what they've been saying to each other for the last 4 days. If only Jesus had been here, this would never have happened. And it's a poignant scene. It is really emotional here. But it's interesting. What is Jesus' emotion like? He weeps.
Shortest sentence in the Bible.
Jesus wept, shortest sentence in the Bible, shortest verse, right? So you can memorize a whole verse with those 2 words.
He was being compassionate.
He was, I think his compassion absolutely shows through. He is full of compassion with them. The interesting thing is that this word deeply moved in verse 33 is sort of not a great translation. This word deeply moved literally means to snort with anger. Right? Isn't that strange? Jesus was angry. It's twice, it's used twice in this passage. It's again in verse, I think it's 38, to snort with anger, to be moved with anger. Very often in Hebrew language, anger is associated with the nostrils and with snorting and with breath coming out of the nostrils. If you happen to be in Bible class on Sunday morning, we read the poem in Exodus 15 that talks about God's wrath for the Egyptians coming out as a snort of anger that blows the Red Sea separate so that the people can cross. That snort with anger thing runs all the way from Hebrew through. And here Jesus is moved with anger in spirit and troubled. And yet we know he's so compassionate with the women, right? He has never failed to be compassionate, and their reaction says that that is consistent. So why is Jesus angry?
He's mad at Mary specifically?
Do you think he's mad at Mary?
Because it says when he saw her weeping, well, then the Jews were also weeping though. Yeah. So he was.
So does it make sense to you that Jesus is mad at Mary? No, I see no's. Not to me either.
That they didn't trust him, I guess. Like he's kind of been leaving these hints.
Okay, is there some anger that they haven't understood and they haven't trusted him? I don't know, maybe.
Is it a sign of impatience? I know what I'm going to be doing, and let's get to it.
Okay, I know what I'm going to be doing. What is he going to be doing?
He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead.
He's going to raise.
And could that snort of anger just be, I'm ready to do it, God, let me
Except
go.
he's also weeping.
Or what death does to people, like how it's so corrosive and terrible. regardless
What?
of
Okay.
him knowing that it'll be raised. Just the grief of sin causing death is like a terrible thing.
The grief of sin causing death is a terrible thing, is what Lee said. I think that's it. This is what's been running through this theme has been running through these healings, right? The terrible corrosive effects of sin. Go ahead, Becky.
I was just gonna say, my translation that's NIV says he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. It didn't say anything about anger, and so
Okay,
it's confusing.
the word deeply moved is the word embrib. No, I should have learned to pronounce this before I came in. Let me not try to pronounce it. It's the to snort with anger. So the in spirit, like those are separate words in the text. Troubled is a separate word in the text. It means to be stirred up. So I think troubled is a good translation for it, right? If the waters are stirred, the waters are troubled, the waters are stirred up. Would not get it. Our translators were so mystified by snorting with anger that instead they translated deeply moved, and they did it twice. They did it again in verse 38. It's the same word in 38 where you see deeply moved again. Deeply moved within this time. It doesn't say troubled in that one, but this both times. Deeply moved, if you want to make a little note, you cross out deeply moved and put snort with anger. He was snorting with anger. Or moved with anger might be a more sort of a good translation for that. He was moved with anger. I think we have to get really deep into what John is doing over the course of these healings. If we can call Lazarus a healing, I guess. To see why Jesus would be angry. And I think it's exactly that, the suffering that his friends are going through, the grief, the sorrow, just what it is, the devastation that results from sin and death in the world have taken the life of his friends and caused his other friends. And Jesus has left his place of safety and support, right, to come here to see the very enemy that he will go to the cross to defeat, the last enemy of death. And he doesn't want anyone to have the grief and sorrow that death causes. Let's look at 38 through 44. Would someone read that? Maybe he could, but do you read it that way? I don't know either.
They're not, they say they believe he can do anything, but they don't act like they're, I don't know.
I think if it was the disciples, I could see why he would be angry at them, because he had just told them all this stuff about he's going to do it. But with the Jews, they're not that great of believers in him, so.
Yeah. I think the sisters count as disciples. They seem to have a great level of belief without understanding of what Jesus is going to do. But do we blame them? They haven't seen it yet. He's like, believe in my works, but he hasn't done the work yet. So I feel like this is a mystifying passage until we see, angry at the effects of death. Now, I think that's the only thing, to me, that's the only thing that really makes sense of it. Go ahead.
One of the effects in Lazarus' death is they're looking for a scapegoat. And Jesus, you should have been here earlier. And that might have hurt his feelings a little.
So even just the recriminations that result from the suffering in the world, maybe.
Both sisters said the same thing.
Both sisters said the same thing. I think, to me, I think Jesus has, it reads to me, now we want wouldn't you like it if this were written in the style where you get lots of more explanation of how people were feeling and how they were thinking and the quirk of an eyebrow and like we get in modern novels or something, right? We don't get that, but to me it reads as he feels like they're allowed to say that to him. Yeah, like he can handle that. Just, the Psalms are always full of reproach at God, and God never rebukes that reproach. So, yeah.
But Jesus has shown anger at other times.
Yes, in John, the last time we saw Jesus angry was at the temple cleansing, or at least the behavior there. Yeah.
And here are a whole bunch of Jews, plus Mary and Martha, gathered around him. And why didn't you come earlier? Why didn't you? There may have been a lot hurled at him. And he's just kind of fed up. I thought you believed in me.
And he has his own timetable, and they're trying to rush the timetable.
Okay, the timetable, yeah.
He has
really matters. We've seen it mentioned a lot of times.
Right, it's not his time yet, and so maybe, and they're trying to push Jesus into their own timetable, their own thoughts of what he should be doing, and he's trying to teach them patience, in his methods.
So there's a big difference between earthly time and heavenly time.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So
Did Jesus heal Jairus' daughter before this happened or after this?
Not in John.
But so we don't have any idea when
Right.
it was and then it
Yeah. I mean, this is the approach to the Passion Week. So, I mean, if we were to try to harmonize that, we would say before. He heals an official son in John in chapter 2 or 3.
I
But-
was thinking of somebody who said, "Oh, this person is dead," and real dramatic.
Right.
So it's going.
So-
I did it before.
Right, but this is John's presentation, right? And so John is quite the literary master here, right? And so when he tells us that Jesus snorted with anger, I think he's trying to do something with that is different than just saying Jesus was tired of being nagged, or like of being told this is your fault, or I think he's trying to do something, because everything he does is trying to do something. So let's continue, because we're running out of time.
It's more for overall sin than individual things. Just
Or the individual effects of overall sin, maybe? Yeah. Verse 38. So Jesus, again being moved with anger, I'm editing as I go, within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, remove the stone. What do we notice? Roll the stone away. It sounds very much like what will be happening. We've got foreshadowing for Jesus' tomb with the cave and the stone right here, right? Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead 4 days. Okay, why might she be mentioning that?
because it's true.
Okay.
You don't really want to take that stone away right now.
Okay, but John just doesn't tell us everything that's true, right? John tells us things that matter, so why would that matter?
Like 4 days dead. Totally
4 days is dead is all the way dead, right? Okay, so there is like an evidentiary concern here to testify that Lazarus has really been dead long enough that the validity of this miracle is not in question. Like, it's not like, well, he wasn't really dead, right? So this is yes. So if it's in the story, it's true, it's vivid. I like it, the inclusion for that, but I think there's also a bit of like evidence here. Verse 40, Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And we know that they do believe, because we have this great confession, right? So they removed the stone, and Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, some of whom are probably his opponents, I said it so that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said these things, he cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to him, unbind him and let him go. There's symbolism, a lot of symbolism there and foreshadowing there that we don't have time to get into. Therefore, many of the Jews came to Mary and saw, where's my next page? No, this is right. And saw what he had done and believed in him, right? So this is a wonderful miracle, isn't it? Lazarus emerges from the grave. It's the final sign of Jesus in the first half of the book of John, right? So we said this is sometimes called the book of signs, right? And here we have that final sign. It's a wonderful miracle, but it doesn't actually fix all the problems. Lazarus will die again. Mary and Martha will die. Thomas and the disciples will die. Death will keep winning. So we have to look beyond this day to what will come out of the raising of Lazarus. Verse 46, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? If this man is performing many signs, if we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him. Interesting. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Why would the Romans come take away our place and our nation?
When like upstarts.
Upstarts. Okay. So this would be a political uprising. If someone claims to be a Messiah, remember how they had already said if anyone acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah, they're going to be put out of the synagogue, because otherwise that makes them a place of political rebellion against the Romans. They are really in danger against the Romans. Is this a valid danger? Yes, because by the time this book is written, Jerusalem has been completely destroyed by the Romans for a political uprising by the Jews. So yes, there's a real danger here. Verse 49, but one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people and that the whole nation not perish. Now, is Caiaphas a good guy? No. And yet, look here. Now, he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Remember the sheep of other pastures that Jesus mentioned in his Good Shepherd, right? So from that day on, they planned together to kill Jesus, right? So there are informants. The Jewish leadership has been looking for informants. They get them, they go tell on Jesus. And so what is the outcome of Jesus's raising of Lazarus going to be?
He's in danger.
Yeah, death.
Walk openly among the Jews.
Right? This event has codified their decision and their plan to kill Jesus. So what we have learned that Jesus' decision, let us go to Judea. Wait, they were about to stone you. Jesus' decision to go to Judea is a point of no return in this drama. Right? A point of no return is a literary device. We see it in Shakespeare. We see it in a lot of dramas, especially tragedies, where there's a thing that happens, a decision that's made, and once that is made, there is no going back. The events are going to keep falling. The dominoes are going to fall. And literarily in John, this is the point where Jesus' fate is sealed. He is going to the cross. But it's interesting because is it only his decision to go to Judea? Is that the only part of the decision that made this a point of no return? What if he had just gone right away instead of waiting 2 more days from where he was?
It wouldn't have been a miracle.
Would have been a healing.
Yeah, which isn't enough.
Yeah, a healing
It's
you
not
can
enough.
explain other ways. And I think that was the whole point of the 4 days, because you could explain away a healing. You could say it was, magic or whatever, or the person was going to get better.
Or there were other
anyway,
Jewish healers
or
or
something. Yeah, or they were going to get better anyway. But the waiting the 4 days is important because that was to their thinking that he is truly dead, and that this is a much bigger deal that he can heal the dead.
right?
Raise the dead, as opposed to just healing a sick person.
Right. So the real point of no return is not just going to Judea, but going to Judea after waiting until Lazarus is dead, right? Therefore, he loved them. Therefore, he waited 2 more days. He went and raised them. Jesus instigated this raising from the dead event, but I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, right? This is how all of this fits together. Therefore, he loved him. I am glad for your sakes. Jesus was ready to do the very thing that would bring him to the point of no return and lead him to the cross. Mary.
That, I know they didn't have punctuation.
Oh.
But in verse 51 and 52 is all one sentence. And it makes it sound like the high priest prophesied, it says that much, that not only for the nation, but also, he just keeps going. So it sounds like he knows what would come.
Who's saying 51 and 52? Whose point of view is that from?
The high priest.
So the high priest is being referred to in the third person. Now, he did not say this on his own initiative. So the high priest isn't continuing to say this. Someone else is saying this. Who is saying it? John. John is saying this from, and you've made the exact point here, right? From his perspective of consideration after his years, right? John is giving us his perspective of maturity that, okay, Caiaphas is not a good guy. We know that. And yet, God still used him. This was still a prophecy. And yes, he said it because it was true and it was God's truth. And this is what's going to happen. John is giving us in this 51 and 52 kind of the same idea that we have had to really wrestle with to put together from the therefore he waited and I was glad I was not there and I am the resurrection and the life. It all goes together because Jesus has to do the redemptive work of the cross to be the resurrection for all of us, right? Not just for Lazarus, not I am the resurrection for one guy. I am the resurrection for all of you. I am glad for your sakes, right? That I am going to do this. Jesus chose to go to Judea out of love for his friend Lazarus, but more than that, out of love for all of them, for Mary and Martha and his disciples, and for you and for me, for all of us, not the nation only, but gathered together, the children of God who are scattered abroad. We are those children of God scattered abroad here, right? For all of us in order to truly show the glory of God. Right? What makes Jesus snort with anger, what makes him deeply moved is this fallout from sin and death. And it will take the cross to address those things, right? The suffering and grief that he could see on his friends' faces as they wept is what will, his love for them in that will propel him all the way to his death. Right? He chose a point of no return that would lead him to the cross. It's the only thing that will fix it, right? It's been the grief of sin and its toxic power over humanity has been generations and generations. And here is Jesus ready to do the redemptive work to bring us back from that if we will believe. And so we see his anger at death and suffering and his determination to go to Judea, even though they're going to stone you there, to continue through in his decision to wait, to raise Lazarus instead of just healing him so that he could be the resurrection and the life. This passage, that therefore has just nagged at me for years. And it really took seeing how thematic element of the Jesus dealing with how sin is related to suffering that runs through these passages to see what's happening in this passage. So thank you all for your great discussion today. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed it. Next week, no lesson, because next week is service day. On Tuesday and Wednesday will be off. So our next lesson for Tuesday will be November 5th on Jesus washes the disciples' feet. We'll do a little bit more than just that because we'll cover John 12 and 13. And the Wednesday night group will actually be off for 2 weeks and we'll pick up on November 13th. Each group will have 2 lessons in November, but they're slightly offset due to some scheduling things. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna, for another wonderful lesson, convicting and convincing.